What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 games that were better than I expected in 2023. And while it's still a little early, so there might be a few yet to surprise me, I think it's safe to say it's been a pretty tremendous year for game releases, and I've been looking back over the many games I've reviewed already this year, and I was reminded that some of them really surpassed my expectations in some pretty memorable ways. So I thought it would be fun to make a list talking about that, and what some of those games were and why. But I think it's important to note at the beginning here that, despite reports to the contrary, I am in fact a human being, which means I'm subject to my own biases and expectations when going into a game. And those things are ultimately going to define whether or not a game surprises you or not. As an example, I expected Baldur's Gate 3 to be very good going into it because I followed it throughout its early access period, covered it intensely before and after its release, so it was of no surprise to me that that game was as good as it was. So with these games, I had some preconceived notion that actually playing the game managed to smash. But with no further ado, let's jump in and talk about some of those. First up, we have Aliens Dark Descent, a real-time TRPG, which is a pretty rare breed of game. Most TRPGs are turn-based tactical affairs and don't use real-time with pause systems. There are, however, a few of them. I became aware of this game's release as part of a comment somebody left on one of my videos asking me about it, which caused me to look it up. And while the Aliens franchise doesn't particularly speak to me, like I think it's pretty cool for what it is, I was just very interested in the real-time TRPG aspect of it, so I knew I was going to play it. But given that it was a licensed game with the Aliens franchise attached to it, I really wasn't expecting a ton in terms of quality, as previous Aliens games have been very hit or miss. To my pleasant surprise, Dark Descent is a fantastic TRPG that sees us managing our Marines, including things like their stress as they deal with this alien menace. There's also a cult conspiring against you as well, which leads to some rather grotesque, almost body horror type moments. But above all, what I would say Dark Descent really managed to nail, despite the top-down isometric view for most of it, is the atmosphere of tension and fear that you would expect from the Aliens franchise. You never feel quite safe, you're actively being hunted by these things, you're trying to avoid being seen as much as possible, you've got to utilize tools that help you do exactly that, setting up motion trackers, finding where things are, and even then, sometimes it just turns into a gigantic firefight. And all of that combines to make a game that felt very unique and was well put together at the same time. Meaning, of course, that I enjoyed it a great deal and was pleasantly surprised by how good that game turned out to be, as my review also reflects. Next up on the list, however, keeping with the TRPGs though, we have Showgunners, a relatively short indie TRPG that is more or less a version of Running Man. We play in a future dystopia where contestants compete on a game show for their very lives, and we have to guide a team of contestants through a variety of turn-based tactical battles and also an exploration phase that sees us moving through a course of sorts where you have to solve puzzles, avoid traps, that kind of thing. And it was a really interesting blend of those mechanics. But the reason Showgunners surprised me and was better than I expected was simply due to how much of a focused and polished experience it was. I have played many TRPGs, and after a while, you kind of get a feel of what you expect that genre to be. And while I would say that Showgunners does not necessarily push the envelope in any particular direction in terms of its mechanics or approaches to things, what it does manage to do is execute all of those mechanics and approaches in a really fun, focused way, which led to my only real complaint for the title being that it is a bit short, with most playthroughs coming in at like 10 to 15 hours. And I think Showgunners is a great example of knowing exactly what you want to do with a game and managing to execute on that very, very well. Because after going into it expecting a pretty run-of-the-mill indie TRPG that I've played 100 of, I instead got a very memorable experience that they nailed pretty much every aspect of. Though that does bring us to entry number 3, and this one is a little bit different as it is an older title with BioShock 2. Just this past year I played through the BioShock series for the first time, as when I'm not reviewing new games I typically review older games, and I just had never gotten a chance to play BioShock before. However, given how long that game had been out, people have very strong opinions about all 3 games in the series, and I had generally gotten the impression that 1 was really great, 2 had good gameplay, but that was about it, and most people really enjoyed the multiverse thing from Infinite. And after hearing everybody just generally not like 2 quite as much as the others. I was thus pleasantly surprised when I played it and honestly really enjoyed it. I would say 2 is actually my favorite of the trilogy, and it's definitely one of those examples of why I try not to read or pay too much attention to other people's reviews before I do my own, because kind of subconsciously I just expected 2 to not be very good. And while I do think people have some valid complaints about the title, the improved gameplay mechanics and a story that was more interesting to me personally, combined with great DLC like Minerva's Den, really sold it for me. Now, the downside to that is that because you've already explored Rapture in the first game, coming back for the second one means that you're pretty much already familiar with the setting and the world, so it's harder to wow you with big story moments like the first game managed to pull off. And that's to say nothing to the many improvements to the gameplay, and seeing as you get to play as a big daddy in this one, that is also pretty interesting, but things like the new weapons, the ability to use a power and a weapon at the same time, and a variety of other changes just make the actual gameplay of this one feel so much better than the other one. Which is why, of course, it is now my favorite of the 3. And I'm really glad I played through that series. The entire series was really fun to go through and take a look at for the first time, but 2 really stood out to me. And some of that was my own fault for setting up those expectations without experiencing it for myself, but in any case, it was a great time. Now, number 4 on the list is a game called Atlas Fallen, a relatively recent release. This came out actually back in August, right at the beginning of the month, which had the unfortunate consequence of putting this game right between a bunch of much larger releases, which saw quite a few people overlook this one, especially since this one is a more reserved AA experience that focuses on its action combat. But this particular game sets you in a world where humans have effectively been enslaved by the gods, forced to mine for a resource that has effectively stripped the planet dry and turned it into a bit of a wasteland, and after encountering a magic glove of sorts, and a being that inhabits said glove, we can start setting some of that right, which involves things like literally skating through the sands that they call sand surfing, fighting all sorts of large monsters, and it's the type of game, if you like things like Devil May Cry, for instance, this would probably be a fun one for you, and that, coupled with a really interesting world and all sorts of lore to uncover, had me surprisingly immersed in what was going on and eager to see how it panned out and ended. And given that interesting world and lore combined with fun mechanics like, again, just sort of sand surfing your way through these things, exploring and discovering all sorts of things, such as more background about what happened in the world and how the gods of it have effectively used worship of themselves to enslave the human race, was just a lot of great fun. And while I'd be lying if I said I think Atlas Fallen will be some well-remembered game for years to come, I can say that while I went into this game expecting just a pretty run-of-the-mill AA beat-em-up of sorts, what I got was a surprisingly interesting narrative attached to some really fun gameplay and a mysterious world that I enjoyed unraveling. So while I don't think this one is going to be for everyone, I really did have a blast with it. Now, to bring this list to a close, we have our final entry, which is none other than Armored Core 6. Now, with this being a From Software title, I'm sure many people are in the comments like, well, of course it was going to be amazing. Personally, I wasn't so sure about it. In fact, I was not initially planning to review this game at all, and I probably wouldn't have even given it a chance if it wasn't for the developer, as typically things like big mech battlers aren't generally my thing. And given the fact that this was the 6th entry and I knew nothing about the series at all prior to the release of this game, needless to say I had my doubts. But after just a few hours of playing it, getting to mess around with the pretty superb combat loop and gameplay involved, I really was having a blast, and that, combined with things like the mech customization and all the different builds and approaches you can take, figuring out what piece of your mech does which thing. For instance, each pair of legs you can equip has a different effect of sorts that changes how your mech moves and flies around, all led to a lot of really well-received gameplay additions that made customizing your mech feel really, really rewarding. And even the story, which started off pretty slow, eventually managed to wind its way back to something really interesting once I started learning and memorizing which mech was who, and the companies and logos associated with them. And once I got that sorted out, the story itself started to be really interesting, especially when you get to the New Game Plus modes where you can actually unlock some new options and see a different ending, and get the full story of what is actually going on. And because of all those things, I wanted to put Armored Core 6 last here, because this game surprised and surpassed my expectations in basically every way. I went from being very hesitant to play it at all, as it makes up a type of genre I don't typically enjoy, and a series I had just never heard of. But in spite of that, even after just a few short hours of playing, I could tell it was something that was really good, and I wanted to play more of. And getting 100% on this one was a really rewarding experience for all of the above reasons. But that, I think, is pretty well going to wrap up this video of games that surpassed my expectations, though I would love to hear about any games this year that you've played that really surprised you or were simply better than you anticipated them being, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.